I'm going to be talking to Dr. Kristen Biezenbos, who is with the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, about a CBC op-ed she wrote titled, "Alberta needs a greener grid, but access fees could swamp us if we don't fix the system." So welcome to the interview, Kristen.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So let's start with how we got here. There were some changes over the last, I remember when I was living in Alberta, they started in the late 1990s under Ralph Klein, if I remember correctly. Maybe you could tell us what those changes were.
So before the 1990s, the late 1990s, Alberta had a system, an electricity system that was really dominated by three vertically integrated monopolies that were privately owned. And when we say vertically integrated, we mean companies that own all aspects of the electricity system, including generation, transmission, and distribution. But in the late 1990s, following the example of some jurisdictions in the US, like California and Texas, we saw a deregulation push here in Alberta, which it's called unbundling. So it's actually forcing companies that were previously monopolies to divest themselves of certain parts of their electricity business to open them up for competition. And in particular in Alberta, we do see healthy competition with respect to retail services and to, arguably a lesser extent generation, but we still have monopolies providing our transmission services and our distribution services.
Okay, so the reason we're having this interview is because the fees that Albertans are being charged for transmission, distribution, and so on are now make up half the bill. Not right. In addition to, and then of course the other is the energy costs. And I'm seeing on social media many of my Alberta readers complaining that their bills, electricity bills, are huge. So why have those fees increased?
There's really been a rise in costs across the board. So part of it is the generated cost of electricity has gone up exponentially in the past few years. There's a few reasons for that, but probably the easiest and most straightforward explanation is twofold. One, fuel costs have gone up. So Alberta has phased out its coal-fired generation, but it did that by converting coal-fired power plants to natural gas burning power plants. And the cost of natural gas, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has gone up quite a lot. And then the other explanation is that it's a bit complicated, but I mentioned before that in the late 1990s, we tried to get these monopolies to give up their control of their generation assets to get more competition in. But the way that we did that was through a special type of contractual arrangement, which has ended. And so all of those former monopolies have come back into possession and control of their generation assets. And we have seen the bids that they're making into our power pools go up quite a bit, especially in the last few years.
Now, what about fees for distribution and transmission? Why have those risen?
So the transmission is because we have, a lot of people say that Alberta has an overbuilt system. So what they usually mean, there's a few things that they mean by that. One thing is that we built a transmission system that is probably more technologically advanced and in some places probably more comprehensive than we actually needed. And then the other thing is that we have seen, especially with the ATCO settlement that just came out yesterday, that there has been some bad behavior by transmission companies where they have either just completely overcharged Albertans through sort of chicanery and creative accounting, or they've done what's called gold plating, which is that they have exaggerated costs, added costs that weren't strictly necessary. A lot of those things, it's actually quite difficult to catch, because all of the information about expenses related to the transmission system are in the possession of transmission companies. So even the Alberta Utilities Commission, which has a great deal of expertise in this area, has to rely to a large extent on the representations that are being made by these companies. So we have an expensive transmission system, and distribution systems are also quite expensive as we see more and more electrification happening and more new communities springing up, especially around Calgary and Edmonton. Those communities need to be connected to distribution assets. We need upgrades to distribution infrastructure. I know that NMAX is getting ready to pilot a smart meter program. So the distribution system also has been going through some changes that have added to the costs for Alberta ratepayers too.
Okay, and the problem is going to be exacerbated by the fact that economists estimate that Alberta, like other provinces, will need 2 to 3 times more electricity by the time we get to 2050, because of, as you mentioned, I mean, people are buying electric cars, they're putting heat pumps in their homes, and there'll be all kinds of other industrial uses for electricity, so on and so forth. So our electricity system has to expand to provide all of that power, and somebody has to pay the bill. So are Albertans in danger of even higher bills going forward?
I think it's a very real danger. So when we say that the transmission system is overbuilt, unfortunately, it doesn't mean it's overbuilt in a way that means we don't have to build more. We will have to build more transmission to connect more wind and solar, which we desperately need more of. On the one hand, adding more wind and solar generation to our energy mix actually causes the generated cost of electricity to go down. Wind and solar tend to bid into the power pool at significantly lower rates than, let's say, natural gas, because for one thing, they don't have any fuel costs, right? Wind and sun are free. So the cost of running a wind and solar facility is very low. And so the generated cost of electricity associated with renewables is low. Where it gets expensive is that you have to keep building transmission to connect those wind and solar facilities. They need a lot of land, especially big capacity wind farms and solar farms. So they tend to be located in more rural areas. And a lot of the time there isn't already grid infrastructure there. So we need to connect them. And it can cost hundreds of millions of dollars or even more sometimes to build transmission to go out to those wind and solar facilities. And as you say, distribution costs are also likely to rise as we see more upgrades being made to the distribution system to keep up with a rapid pace of electrification. So I think that even if you do see the generated cost of electricity go down as we add more renewables, you will also see the cost of transmission and distribution go up. They might even become more than 50% of the bill, at least in the short term, because it'll take a while to pay off the capital costs of building that new infrastructure.
Well, that doesn't sound like good news for Albertans. What might be some of the fixes for this problem?
So one of the reasons why these changes are going to be very expensive is because of the way that we calculate rates for transmission and distribution companies. So for example, transmission uses what's called cost of service rate making. And cost of service rate making bases the revenue that these companies earn. Since they're monopolies, they have no competition. So in return for maintaining their monopoly, they have regulated rates. So we have the Alberta Utilities Commission reviewing and approving the rates that they ultimately charge us. But those rates also have a revenue that's built in. These are private companies and they have to make a profit. So the profit is actually based on the value of their capital. And the easiest way to raise the value of the capital is to build more infrastructure. So that means that as we have to build out more to green our grid, it could equal a windfall for transmission and distribution companies because beyond just the regular business case of having to build more, we also have a climate change and, we have an environmentally pressing reason to build more. And that is going to equal significant profits for those companies unless we either come up with an alternative to cost of service rate making, or, and this is kind of like my more crazy idea, but I quite like it, but it would be doing things very differently to classify some new transmission infrastructure as being in the public interest and to actually have that transmission infrastructure paid for by the government. So that could be the federal government through the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It could be by Alberta using, for example, our carbon tax, but basically moving the cost of the new transmission out of the rate and into the tax base. So that comes out of the revenue requirements. So we don't have to worry about how will we divide up the rates in order to distribute these costs in a way that doesn't just crush Albertans. In fact, the cost of that transmission would not go into the rate at all. It would be shifted to another area where we have more money and more flexibility, and it would not equal profits for those incumbent utilities, which that would be one of the biggest problems with trying to do something like that, is I imagine the industry pushback would be considerable.
Now, I can understand a transmission doing that because, I mean, what do you got? You have wires and you've got those big towers and the connections and so on. But what about the distribution system, which is, I mean, it gets right down to your individual house, and there has to be upgrades. For example, we put in a heat pump this summer, and that required an upgrade to the supply of the electrical supply to our house. We had to pay for that. But eventually, as more people in our neighborhood buy electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on, they're going to have to increase the supply at the neighborhood level, right, or at the sub-regional level. They're going to new transformers or whatever other equipment they need. Are we in the same? Is Alberta in the same, facing the same problem with the distribution system as it is with the transmission system?
Yes. In a nutshell, yes. It might be, now Alberta is not moving quite as quickly as some other jurisdictions like British Columbia, where you live, for example. We are not pushing as hard on the uptake of electric vehicles. So there may be a little bit more wiggle room in terms of how much time the distribution companies have to make some of these critical upgrades, but they can't avoid it forever. If nothing else, market conditions are just changing. The demand for electric vehicles is growing as we've seen record high energy prices, the interest by people who probably had never thought about owning an electric vehicle, but now that interest is really starting to pick up. And as you say, if you're going to start doing things like charging electric vehicles, electrifying your home, switching to induction ovens, heat pumps, adding demand side resources like rooftop solar, those things put a stress on an old and outdated distribution system, and they need to be upgraded. So that is also another question. How are we going to equitably distribute the costs of upgrading the distribution system so that it doesn't just disproportionately affect especially low-income Albertans? So we also have to think creatively about how we charge rates for distribution and whether or not there are ways to shift some of those costs out of the rate.
Now, final question, Kristen, and this is more of a, maybe it's a bit of a philosophical question, but it gets to your argument that maybe we should look at distribution and transmission as in the public as a public interest investment. And the reason that I think that makes some sense is that it's very clear that national economies are going to be electrifying, partly in response to climate change, partly in response to technological change that makes, electric cars more efficient than internal combustion engine. So the electricity system now, it will, over the next 30 years, the argument goes, will become basically the foundation of the 21st century economy. If you don't invest in that infrastructure, you're at a competitive disadvantage. That then becomes that is a public interest argument. What's your take?
I would agree with that. I actually think that there are multiple arguments to be made for why doing this transition more aggressively, but also funding it as a public interest, almost like a modern New Deal in a way for Canadians. But this infrastructure, it's not just about trying to fight climate change. That is a big part of it. But it also is keeping Canada a competitive economy, an economy that can contribute to the rise of the clean energy economy, which, as you mentioned, is going to become a multi-billion-dollar industry going into the future. And we don't want to get left behind. We're in a good position now, I think, to catch up. But the longer that we wait and the longer we allow certain provinces to become laggards in this area, the further that we fall behind and the less competitive we become.
Well, Kristen, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much for having me.